On a quiet stretch of suburban Georgia, where tree-lined streets curve past gated homes and security cameras hum quietly through the night, a woman walked into a house and was never seen again. There was no struggle caught on camera, no frantic phone call, no eyewitness stepping forward, just a moment that passed unnoticed until it became impossible to explain. In February of 2022, Ciera Breland was 31 years old. She was a successful attorney, a new mother, and by every outward measure, a woman building a stable life. She had a career she worked years to earn, a child she adored, and a future that appeared carefully planned. But beneath the surface of that ordinary image, something was quietly unraveling. Ciera had traveled from Indiana to Georgia with her husband and their infant son to visit family. It was supposed to be a routine trip, temporary, uneventful, forgettable. Instead, it became the last confirmed chapter of her life. Surveillance cameras captured her entering a home in Johns Creek, Georgia. What they never captured was her leaving. Days later, her husband returned to Indiana without her. He had their child. He had the family dog. But Ciera was gone. No luggage. No phone records placing her elsewhere. No video evidence showing her departure. And no explanation that could withstand even the most basic scrutiny. When her disappearance was finally reported, investigators were confronted with a case defined not by what was found, but by what was missing. No body, no crime scene in plain view, no clear timeline after her last appearance on camera. Just silence, growing heavier with each passing day. As detectives began pulling at the loose threads, conflicting statements, unexplained delays, and a trail that seemed to stop cold at the doorway of a single home, one question refused to fade. How does a woman vanish without leaving, without being seen, and without being found, while the people closest to her walk away? What happened inside that house is still unknown. But the absence of answers has become its own kind of evidence. Before investigators ever examined surveillance footage or compared timelines, before questions formed and suspicions hardened, there was a woman living an ordinary life shaped by ambition, discipline, and responsibility. To understand the weight of her disappearance, it is necessary to understand who Ciera Breland was before she vanished, before her name became attached to unanswered questions. Ciera was known first as a professional. She had worked deliberately toward a career in law, a field that demands persistence, attention to detail, and emotional endurance. Becoming an attorney is not a passive achievement. It requires years of study, long hours, and the ability to carry pressure without breaking. Friends and family described her as focused and driven, someone who set goals early and followed through on them. She was not impulsive. She planned. She prepared. And she took her responsibilities seriously. That sense of responsibility extended beyond her career and into her personal life. When Ciera became a mother, it reshaped her priorities in visible ways. Those closest to her noticed the shift immediately. Conversations turned toward her child's future. Her schedule revolved around caregiving, work, and home. She was deeply invested in being present, attentive, and protective. Motherhood was not something she treated lightly or casually. It was central to her identity. From the outside, her life appeared structured and stable. She had a profession that demanded respect. She had a family. She had a home base in Indiana. To acquaintances and coworkers, there was nothing about Ciera that suggested instability or risk-taking. She was not known to disappear without explanation. She did not have a history of cutting off contact. She did not live a life that invited mystery. But those closest to her understood that stability on the surface does not always reflect what is happening privately. Like many people navigating adulthood, marriage, and new parenthood simultaneously, Ciera was under strain. Balancing a legal career with motherhood placed constant demands on her time and emotional energy. And within her marriage, there were tensions that were not visible to the public eye. Family members would later say that Ciera had been unhappy, that she had confided in loved ones about stress within the relationship. These were not dramatic confessions or sudden crises. They were quiet admissions shared in moments of trust. She had spoken about wanting change, about needing space, about considering a different future for herself and her child. These conversations mattered not because they assigned blame but because they established state of mind. Importantly, those who knew her emphasized what she did not do. She did not abandon her child. She did not disappear without warning. She did not walk away from her life impulsively. Any suggestion that she would voluntarily vanish conflicted sharply with everything her family understood about her character. In the weeks leading up to the trip to Georgia, nothing in Ciera's behavior suggested preparation for disappearance. There were no withdrawn funds, no farewell messages, no sudden detachment from work or family. Her communications continued as normal. Her plans extended forward. She was making decisions rooted in continuity, not escape. The trip itself was framed as temporary. A visit, not a relocation. There was no indication she intended to stay behind or separate permanently during that journey. She packed as someone who expected to return. She traveled with her infant son, reinforcing the assumption that this was a routine family visit, not a transition point. To those who loved her, that is one of the most haunting aspects of this case. Ciera did not disappear at the margins of society. She did not fall through unnoticed cracks. She was visible, counted for, embedded in a web of relationships and obligations that would immediately register her absence. And when she stopped communicating, alarm followed quickly. Her family did not accept vague explanations. They did not believe she had chosen silence. They understood her patterns, her priorities, and her limits. From their perspective, something had interrupted her life. Not ended naturally, not paused voluntarily, but stopped without consent. This understanding shaped everything that followed. From the moment she was reported missing, investigators were not dealing with uncertainty about her intentions. They were dealing with the absence of a woman whose life trajectory had been clearly forward-moving. That distinction matters, because in missing persons cases, the first question is often whether someone chose to leave. In Ciera's case, those who knew her best were unequivocal. Leaving without contact was inconsistent with her character. Leaving her child behind was unthinkable. And yet, that is exactly what the evidence would soon suggest. As investigators began reconstructing her final days, they would encounter a growing contradiction between who Ciera was and what appeared to have happened to her. A responsible mother who vanished without her child. A meticulous attorney whose trail ended abruptly. A woman who planned for the future, suddenly erased from it. The more clearly her life came into focus, the more impossible her disappearance became to explain. And that impossibility is what turned concern into suspicion, and a missing persons report into something far more serious. The trip to Georgia was never meant to be significant. It was not planned as a turning point, a confrontation, or a final chapter. It was presented as a routine family visit, the kind of short journey that thousands of families make without consequence. A temporary change of scenery, time with relatives, a brief interruption before returning to everyday life in Indiana. From the outside, nothing about the decision appeared unusual. Traveling with a spouse and an infant to visit family is among the most ordinary of circumstances. There were no emergency messages sent ahead. No visible tension documented in travel records. No indication that this visit carried any greater weight than convenience or obligation. They arrived in Johns Creek, Georgia, an affluent suburban area known for its quiet streets and gated homes. The house they went to belonged to a close family member. It was not a hotel, not a rental, not a public space where comings and goings would naturally be documented by staff or passersby. It was a private residence, shielded by routine and familiarity. That detail would later matter more than anyone could have imagined. Inside the home, there were no confirmed witnesses who publicly described an argument, a crisis, or any obvious sign of distress. What occurred behind closed doors remains known only to those who were present. Investigators would later attempt to reconstruct those hours, but they would be working against silence rather than chaos. In hindsight, every ordinary action surrounding the trip became subject to scrutiny. When did they arrive? Who was present? What rooms were used? What conversations took place? But at the time, there was no reason for alarm. No one called police. No neighbors reported disturbances. No emergency services were summoned. From the outside, the visit unfolded without incident. Surveillance cameras at the residence captured a limited window of activity. One clip, in particular, would later become the most significant piece of visual evidence in the case. It showed her entering the home. The footage was time-stamped. The image was clear enough to establish identity. And then the footage ended. There was no corresponding video of her leaving. No camera angle showed her walking out the door. No timestamp placed her outside the home again. No record captured her entering a vehicle. In a world increasingly documented by digital systems, this absence was not merely unusual, it was alarming. At first, that absence meant nothing. People step outside camera range all the time. Cameras fail. Files overwrite. But as time passed, and as investigators began tracking movements beyond that moment, the lack of evidence became harder to dismiss. What should have followed next was predictable. A return trip, packing bags, loading a car, leaving as a family. Instead, what followed was silence. Days later, the husband returned to Indiana. He had the infant child with him. He had the family dog. But she was not there. There was no confirmed explanation that accounted for her absence in a way that aligned with her known behavior. No credible scenario in which she voluntarily remained behind without contact. No evidence placing her anywhere else. And no communication sent to family, friends, or co-workers explaining her disappearance. What made this even more troubling was the timing. If she had intended to leave on her own, there would have been preparation, planning, communication, some indication of choice. But investigators would find none. The return trip itself raised immediate questions. Why travel back with the child but not the mother? Why bring the family dog but leave behind personal belongings? Why delay reporting her missing? These were not questions fueled by emotion. They were questions rooted in logic. When family members realized she had not returned, concern escalated rapidly. Attempts to reach her went unanswered. Calls went to voicemail. Messages remained unread. The silence was not gradual. It was absolute. At this stage, explanations were offered. She had gone for a walk. She needed space. She left late at night. But none of these explanations produced evidence. There were no sightings, no surveillance footage elsewhere, no credit card usage, no phone pings placing her outside the residence. As investigators later confirmed, there was no proof she ever left Georgia. The significance of that fact cannot be overstated. In missing persons investigations, movement is often the key to resolution. Person leaves a location. A vehicle is spotted. A transaction occurs. A digital footprint forms. In this case, movement stopped. Her known world narrowed to a single address. As days turned into weeks, the ordinary nature of the trip collapsed under the weight of unanswered questions. What was supposed to be temporary had become permanent. What was supposed to be forgettable had become unforgettable. The Georgia trip was no longer just the last place she was seen. It was the last place her life could be traced with certainty. And the longer investigators studied that moment, the arrival, the surveillance footage, the unexplained absence, the clearer one truth became. Whatever happened to her did not happen on the road. It did not happen in transit. It did not happen somewhere far away. It happened after she walked into that house. And that realization marked the moment when this case shifted from missing to suspicious. Every investigation has a moment where certainty ends. In this case, that moment was captured by a security camera, silent, brief, and devastating in its simplicity. The footage is unremarkable at first glance. There is no urgency in her movement, no visible fear, no struggle. She walks toward the entrance of a private home in Johns Creek, Georgia, carrying herself the way anyone does when arriving somewhere familiar. The timestamp places her arrival clearly within the timeline investigators would later construct. It is the final verified image of her alive. After that, the record goes dark. No camera captures her leaving the home. Not from the front entrance. Not from the driveway. Not from the surrounding streets. Investigators reviewed available footage carefully, frame by frame, searching for any indication that she exited the property at a later time. They found none. At first, this absence could be dismissed as a technical limitation. Cameras do not see everything. Angles miss blind spots. Systems fail. But as the investigation progressed, the lack of departure footage took on a different weight. It was not just missing video, it was missing corroboration. In the hours and days that followed her arrival, there was no independent evidence placing her anywhere else. No neighbor reported seeing her outside. No delivery driver encountered her. No store camera recorded her presence. No vehicle was observed leaving with her inside. The ordinary trail that follows a living person simply stopped. Investigators expanded their search beyond video. They examined digital data, phone records, location services, communication logs. The results only deepened the mystery. Her phone showed no confirmed activity beyond the period shortly after her arrival. There were no outgoing calls, no messages sent, no movements detected that could be reliably traced to her. In modern investigations, digital silence is rare. Even brief outings tend to leave a trace: location data, app activity, network connections. In this case, that digital footprint was either absent or inaccessible. The silence did not suggest movement. It suggested interruption. This single point, the moment she entered the home, became the axis around which the entire investigation turned. Everything before it could be verified. Everything after it could not. Law enforcement did not publicly disclose every detail of what they observed in the footage. They were careful with language, careful not to speculate, careful not to compromise an open case. But their actions spoke clearly. The home was searched. Items were collected. The assumption that she had simply walked away was no longer sufficient. Investigators also focused on what did not occur. There was no evidence of her packing belongings. No indication she prepared to stay behind. No communications suggesting she intended to separate herself from her child. For a woman known to plan carefully, the absence of preparation was striking. Family members echoed this point repeatedly. She did not disappear casually. She did not cut off contact without explanation. And she did not leave her child behind voluntarily. As the timeline narrowed, the importance of the last sighting grew heavier. It was not just the final image of her. It was the final moment when her safety could be assumed. After that moment, every explanation required something extraordinary to have happened. Something that left no witnesses, no records, and no trace beyond the walls of a private residence. Investigators also examined the surrounding area. Roads, intersections, businesses, traffic cameras. They searched for any vehicle movement that might suggest she left the property unnoticed. Again, they found nothing that placed her outside the home after her arrival. This absence was not proof of a crime, but it was proof of something else: improbability. The probability that a person with no history of disappearance, no financial preparation, no communications, and no confirmed movements simply vanished from a secured residential area was low. The probability that all evidence of her departure failed simultaneously was lower still. And yet, that was the scenario investigators were being asked to accept. As days turned into weeks, the footage became more than evidence. It became a boundary. Everything on one side was known. Everything on the other was speculation. Law enforcement officials would later confirm that they could not place her anywhere beyond that residence. Not in Georgia. Not in Indiana. Not in transit between the two. From an investigative standpoint, this was not just troubling, it was defining. The case was no longer about where she went. It was about what happened after she arrived. That distinction shifted the direction of the investigation entirely. Searches focused inward rather than outward. Interviews revisited moments that had previously seemed insignificant. Timelines tightened. Explanations were tested against facts rather than assumptions. And as that process unfolded, one reality became unavoidable. The last confirmed sighting was not just the final image of her life. It was the moment the truth stopped being visible. The next confirmed movement in this case did not involve her at all. Days after she was last seen entering the home in Johns Creek, a vehicle made the long drive back to Indiana. Inside that vehicle was her infant child. The family dog was there as well. But the seat where she should have been was empty. There was no public record of her traveling separately. No confirmed bus ticket. No rideshare record. No flight reservation. No traffic camera capturing her vehicle leaving Georgia alone. The return trip occurred without any independent evidence that she had chosen not to be part of it. For investigators, this moment marked a critical shift. Up until then, uncertainty could be explained by missing information. But now, there was an action that demanded explanation. A family had returned home incomplete. When questioned about her absence, explanations were offered. She had gone for a walk. She had left late at night. She needed space. But none of these explanations produced corroboration. There were no witnesses who placed her outside the residence. No surveillance footage showing her on nearby streets. No evidence that she had taken belongings necessary for travel or survival. More troubling still was what she left behind. She left behind her child. Those closest to her struggled to reconcile that fact with everything they knew about her. She was not a woman who disappeared without contact. She was not someone who abandoned responsibility. She was not impulsive. And she was not careless with the life she had built. The decision to return home without her raised questions that could not be answered by assumption alone. Why bring the dog but not the mother? Why return with the child if she was supposedly still nearby? Why wait days before reporting her missing? Each question compounded the last. Investigators examined the return journey carefully. They looked for evidence of stops, detours, communications, any sign that she had been involved in planning the return. They found none. There was no message sent to family explaining her absence. No instructions given regarding childcare. No indication she expected to remain behind. When family members learned that she had not returned, concern turned into urgency. Phone calls were made. Messages were sent. Silence followed. That silence did not feel voluntary. Felt wrong. The delay in reporting her missing became another focal point. Time matters in disappearance cases. The first hours are critical. Delays can erase evidence, alter scenes, and complicate timelines. Investigators noted the gap, not as proof of wrongdoing, but as a fact that required explanation. When the missing persons report was finally filed, it did not resolve uncertainty. It amplified it. By this point, investigators were no longer asking where she might have gone. They were asking why there was no proof she had gone anywhere at all. The return without her reframed the entire case. It was no longer possible to treat the disappearance as a misunderstanding or a temporary separation. The evidence did not support a narrative of voluntary absence. It supported a narrative of interruption. As law enforcement began piecing together the timeline, the return trip became a dividing line. Everything before it involved her presence. Everything after it involved her absence. And between those 2 points lay a silence no one could explain. The presence of the child added an emotional weight that could not be ignored. This was not just a missing adult. This was a mother who had been separated from her infant without explanation. The implications of that fact reached beyond investigative procedure and into moral clarity. For her family, the realization was devastating. The hope that she might return on her own began to fade. The belief that she had chosen to disappear collapsed under the weight of evidence. What remained was fear. Fear that something had happened inside a place where no one was watching. Fear that the truth was being obscured by time. Fear that answers might never come. Investigators would later state that they could not place her anywhere after she entered the home in Georgia. The return to Indiana without her did not clarify the mystery. It deepened it, because disappearances usually leave trails. This one left a void, and that void followed the car all the way back across state lines, carrying with it the child she never intended to leave behind. In missing persons cases, time is not just a measurement. It is evidence. Every hour that passes without action allows uncertainty to expand, memories to dull, and physical traces to disappear. That is why the moment a disappearance is formally reported matters almost as much as the moment the person was last seen. In this case, that moment did not come immediately. Days passed between the last confirmed sighting of her in Georgia and the filing of an official missing person report in Indiana. During that time, explanations were offered, but none were supported by verifiable proof. She had gone for a walk. She had left late at night. She needed time alone. Each explanation relied on assumption rather than confirmation. For investigators, the delay itself became part of the case record, not as an accusation, but as a fact that required documentation and scrutiny. Delays can occur for many reasons: confusion, denial, hope that the situation will resolve itself. But they also complicate investigations in ways that cannot be undone. When the report was finally filed, law enforcement initiated standard missing persons protocols. They collected identifying information, recent photographs, known habits, medical history, and communication patterns. They contacted family members. They reviewed phone records. They attempted to reconstruct the last known timeline. What they found was deeply concerning. There was no indication that she had planned to disappear. No bank withdrawals suggesting preparation. No packed belongings missing. No messages sent to friends or coworkers indicating a desire to leave. Her digital footprint did not reflect movement or intent. It reflected absence. As investigators reached out to people who knew her, a consistent picture emerged. She was reliable. She stayed in contact. She did not miss work without notice. She did not disappear from her child's life. Her silence was not characteristic. It was alarming. Law enforcement also examined the explanation that she had left voluntarily. Voluntary disappearances typically include signs of planning or stress escalation. There are often warning signals, arguments, financial changes, abrupt decisions. In this case, none of those signals aligned with the outcome. The missing person report transformed private concern into public responsibility. Jurisdictional coordination began between Indiana and Georgia. Detectives in both states worked to reconcile timelines, verify movements, and identify contradictions. Attention quickly returned to the Georgia residence. Investigators noted that her last confirmed sighting occurred there, and that no evidence placed her anywhere else afterward. This made the location central to the inquiry, not because of speculation but because of process. The last known place a missing person was seen is always the starting point. Searches were conducted. Evidence was collected. Items were removed for forensic analysis. Law enforcement did not disclose all findings, citing the integrity of an ongoing investigation. But the scope of their actions indicated concern beyond a routine missing persons case. As news of her disappearance spread, media coverage began to grow. Headlines emphasized her profession, her age, and her status as a mother. Public attention intensified. With it came pressure on investigators, on family members, and on those closest to her to provide answers. For her family, the missing person report marked the moment hope shifted into something more painful. The belief that she might simply return faded as days passed without contact. Each unanswered call reinforced the reality that something was wrong. Investigators continued to evaluate every explanation against available evidence. They did not rely on emotion. They relied on consistency. And consistency was absent. The delay in reporting her missing did not determine guilt. But it did limit opportunity. By the time the report was filed, valuable hours had passed. Surveillance footage was overwritten. Environmental conditions had changed. Potential witnesses had gone about their lives unaware that a moment they observed might matter. What remained was a case defined by what could no longer be recovered. From that point forward, the investigation moved under a different assumption. Not that she would return, but that she had been prevented from doing so. The question shifted from where she might be to what had happened before anyone realized she was gone. The missing person report did not close the gap in the timeline. It exposed it, and once that gap was visible, it could not be ignored. Once the missing person report was filed, the investigation shifted from concern to method. Detectives moved carefully, aware that every decision carried weight in a case where physical evidence was limited and time had already passed. The first priority was confirmation. Investigators needed to establish, beyond assumption, where she had last been seen and whether any evidence placed her elsewhere afterward. Surveillance footage from the Georgia residence was reviewed again. Not casually but systematically, checking timestamps, angles, blind spots, and continuity. The conclusion remained unchanged. She entered the home. She was not captured leaving it. That finding did not prove a crime, but it established a boundary investigators could not ignore. Attention then turned inward. Law enforcement executed searches at the Georgia residence, focusing on areas most likely to yield trace evidence. Items were removed for forensic analysis. These actions were not announced with detail, but they were visible enough to signal seriousness. In missing person cases, such measures are taken only when investigators believe the disappearance may involve foul play. Detectives also began the process of interviewing everyone connected to the final timeline. Statements were collected, compared, and revisited. Inconsistencies were noted. Not all contradictions are criminal. Memory is imperfect. Stress alters perception, but patterns matter. When details shift repeatedly, investigators take notice. Digital evidence was examined next. Phone records were reviewed for activity, location data, and usage patterns. Investigators searched for outgoing communications, app activity, and location pings that might indicate movement after her arrival. What they found was absence. Her digital presence effectively stopped. This silence posed a challenge. Phones can be turned off. Devices can be damaged. But in most cases, some trace remains. Here, there was no clear signal that she had traveled, communicated, or accessed services beyond that final window of time. Financial records were also reviewed. Bank accounts showed no withdrawals consistent with planning a disappearance. Credit cards were not used. There were no transactions suggesting travel, lodging, or survival expenses. This absence reinforced what investigators already suspected. There was no evidence of preparation. Investigators then examined vehicles connected to the case. Travel routes were reconstructed. Traffic cameras and license plate readers were checked where available. Again, no evidence placed her outside the Georgia residence after her arrival. The investigation expanded geographically, but the results did not. Indiana authorities coordinated with Georgia law enforcement, sharing findings and aligning timelines. Despite the multi-state effort, all roads led back to the same point. As pressure mounted, investigators faced a familiar dilemma. Without a body, without a confirmed crime scene, and without a clear cause of disappearance, options were limited. Prosecutors require evidence that meets a specific threshold. Suspicion alone does not satisfy that standard. Law enforcement officials were careful with public statements. They confirmed the case remained active. They acknowledged the unusual circumstances, but they did not speculate. This restraint frustrated the public but reflected legal reality. Speaking too freely could compromise future proceedings. Meanwhile, investigators continued to test explanations against facts. The idea that she had left voluntarily was measured against her history, behavior, and evidence. It did not fit. The idea that she had been abducted by a stranger was considered, but no signs of forced entry, struggle, or outside involvement supported that theory. Each hypothesis failed under scrutiny. The investigation did not stall for lack of effort. It stalled because evidence refused to surface. Behind the scenes, detectives revisited the timeline repeatedly. Minutes mattered. Small windows of opportunity were examined. Who was present? Who left? Who stayed? Who could account for their movements? Each answer narrowed possibilities without confirming conclusions. The residence itself remained central, not because of assumption, but because of process. The last known location of a missing person is always critical. In this case, that location also happened to be private, controlled, and undocumented beyond a limited surveillance window. That reality complicated everything. Without independent witnesses, investigators had to rely on statements and physical evidence. Without clear physical evidence, statements carried disproportionate weight. And when statements conflicted or evolved, investigators were left balancing caution against urgency. Family members continued to press for answers. They spoke publicly, advocating for continued attention. They emphasized her character, her love for her child, and the impossibility of voluntary disappearance. Their voices kept the case alive when progress slowed. Investigators also had to manage public speculation. Online theories proliferated. Some were grounded in available facts. Others were not. Law enforcement consistently warned against rumor, not to protect individuals, but to protect the integrity of the case. False narratives can contaminate witness recollections and distort evidence. As months passed, the investigation entered a difficult phase. Evidence collection had largely concluded. Interviews had been conducted. Leads had been followed. What remained was analysis and patience. This is often the most frustrating stage of an unsolved case. From the outside, it appears as though nothing is happening. From the inside, detectives are waiting for new information, for someone to speak, for a mistake to surface, for a piece of evidence to be re-examined with fresh eyes. The absence of resolution does not mean the absence of work. Law enforcement confirmed that there was no evidence she had left Georgia. They confirmed that the case remained open. They confirmed that investigators had not ruled out foul play. But they could not confirm what had happened inside that home. That uncertainty defined the investigation. Not because answers were impossible, but because they were hidden. And until something changes, until evidence emerges, until silence breaks, the case remains suspended in that final moment, frozen between arrival and disappearance. When investigators attempt to understand a disappearance, they examine not only movements and timelines, but pressure. Stress does not prove wrongdoing, but it provides context. And context, when handled carefully, can help explain why certain possibilities carry more weight than others. In this case, attention inevitably turned to the marriage, not as a conclusion, but as a circumstance that shaped the days leading up to her disappearance. Those closest to her would later describe a relationship under strain. The stress was not dramatic or publicly visible. There were no police calls, no documented altercations, no outward signs that suggested imminent danger. Instead, the tension appeared in quieter ways, through conversations shared privately with family and friends. She had spoken about unhappiness, about feeling overwhelmed, about wanting change. These were not statements of crisis, but they mattered because they revealed state of mind. They showed a woman evaluating her future, not abandoning it. Importantly, those conversations also revealed what she was not planning. She was not preparing to disappear. She was not discussing escape or secrecy. She was discussing resolution, options, stability for herself and her child. Investigators treat such statements cautiously. Emotional dissatisfaction is common. It does not predict violence. It does not indicate intent. But when combined with sudden disappearance, it becomes part of a larger picture. Marriage can introduce pressures that remain invisible to outsiders. Financial strain, career imbalance, parenting stress, expectations that collide with reality. In this case, she was navigating all of these at once. A demanding profession, new motherhood, a relationship under stress. None of these are unusual on their own. Together, they create vulnerability not to wrongdoing but to disruption. Law enforcement examined these dynamics without assigning blame. Their role was not to judge the relationship, but to understand whether it provided insight into motive, opportunity, or sequence of events. They looked for evidence, not narrative. Family members were careful in how they spoke publicly. They did not accuse. They emphasized her character. They emphasized what she would not do. Their focus remained on her disappearance, not on speculation. Investigators also understood the danger of oversimplification. It is easy, especially in unsolved cases, to collapse complex relationships into single explanations. That approach rarely serves justice. Instead, detectives treated marital strain as one data point among many. They compared statements. They examined timing. They asked whether stress might explain certain decisions or behaviors without explaining the disappearance itself. In other words, they looked for relevance, not blame. One of the most significant elements investigators considered was her attachment to her child. Motherhood was not peripheral to her identity. It was central. Any theory that required her to abandon that bond voluntarily faced immediate resistance from evidence and testimony. This fact alone limited the range of plausible explanations. If she had planned to leave permanently, there would have been preparation, communication, arrangements. None of those existed. The absence of those steps did not suggest indecision. It suggested interruption. That distinction mattered. As investigators continued their work, they returned repeatedly to the same conclusion. While marital strain provided context, it did not explain the outcome. It did not account for the absence of evidence. It did not produce a clear motive supported by facts. But it did rule out one possibility. It ruled out the idea that she had simply chosen to vanish. In that sense, understanding the marriage did not solve the case. It narrowed it. It removed assumptions that could not withstand scrutiny. It forced the investigation to remain grounded in what could be proven, rather than what might be imagined. For the public, this restraint was difficult to accept. Speculation filled the silence left by unanswered questions. But investigators remained bound by evidence, not inference. The reality is that relationships are complex. They contain conflict without crime, dissatisfaction without danger, and tension without violence. Investigators must separate those realities carefully, or risk misinterpreting normal human strain as proof of wrongdoing. In this case, they did just that. They acknowledged the stress. They documented the statements. They considered the implications. And then they moved forward because context alone could not explain a disappearance this complete. What remained was the same unresolved truth. A woman with responsibilities, plans, and attachments vanished without explanation. And no amount of contextual analysis could change that fact. As the investigation continued without resolution, the case moved beyond law enforcement offices and into the public sphere. Media attention intensified, and with it came speculation, some grounded in verified facts, others driven by frustration and fear. News outlets emphasized the elements that made the disappearance difficult to ignore. A young attorney, a new mother, a last known sighting inside a private home, the absence of evidence placing her anywhere else. These details, repeated across headlines and broadcasts, ensured that the case remained visible. But visibility does not always bring clarity. Online discussions began to form almost immediately. Forums, comment sections, and social media platforms filled with theories. Some questioned timelines. Others scrutinized statements. Many focused on the same central issue, the improbability of a voluntary disappearance under these circumstances. Law enforcement watched this development carefully. Public interest can be helpful when it leads to new tips or witnesses, but it can also complicate investigations by spreading unverified claims and hardening opinions before evidence is tested. Investigators consistently urged restraint. They reminded the public that suspicion is not proof and that incomplete information can distort perception. They were careful not to confirm or deny theories circulating online, understanding that even minor comments could influence witness recollections or future testimony. For the family, media attention was a double-edged reality. On one hand, it kept the case alive. On the other, it exposed deeply personal loss to public scrutiny. Every headline carried emotional weight. Every theory forced them to relive uncertainty. Family members emphasized a single message whenever they spoke publicly. She would not have left her child. They repeated it not as accusation, but as truth grounded in lived experience. Their goal was not to assign blame, but to reject narratives that minimized the seriousness of her disappearance. As speculation grew, investigators had to account for its impact. Potential witnesses can be influenced by what they read or hear. Memories can shift. Statements can become contaminated by suggestion. For this reason, detectives treated new tips with caution, verifying information independently before incorporating it into the case. Media outlets also faced limitations. Without arrests, without charges, and without new evidence, reporting became repetitive. The same facts were revisited. The same unanswered questions were posed. Over time, attention waned, not because the case was solved, but because there was nothing new to report. This ebb in coverage did not mean the investigation had ended. It meant it had entered a quieter phase, one less visible but no less active. Behind the scenes, case files were reviewed. Evidence was re-examined. Leads were reassessed. Public speculation, however, did not slow. The longer a case remains unsolved, the more it invites narrative. People search for meaning in absence. They fill silence with assumption. This is a natural response to uncertainty, but it carries risk. Once a theory takes hold publicly, it can be difficult to dislodge, even if evidence later contradicts it. Law enforcement remained disciplined. They continued to describe the case as open and active. They reiterated that no arrest had been made for her disappearance. They confirmed that investigators had not ruled out foul play, but they refused to draw conclusions without evidence that met legal standards. This balance, acknowledging concern without feeding speculation, was deliberate. It protected the integrity of the case and preserved the possibility of future prosecution. For the family, patience became a form of endurance. They navigated grief without closure, advocacy without answers, and public attention without resolution. Their focus remained singular, keeping her name known, her story remembered, and the investigation alive. The public's role in such cases is complex. Awareness can generate tips. Pressure can sustain momentum. But judgment, when premature, can obscure truth rather than reveal it. In this case, the noise surrounding the disappearance did not resolve it. What resolved it or will remains unknown. And so, beneath the headlines and theories, the investigation continued quietly, grounded in evidence, constrained by law, and defined by a silence no amount of speculation could replace. As public attention intensified, one question surfaced repeatedly. Why, after months of investigation, had no one been arrested for her disappearance? To many observers, the circumstances felt overwhelming. The last confirmed sighting, the absence of movement, the return home without her. But in the justice system, feeling certain is not the same as proving guilt. Criminal cases do not move forward on suspicion alone. They move forward on evidence that can survive scrutiny in court. And in this case, that threshold had not been met. One of the most significant barriers was the absence of a body. While homicide prosecutions without remains are possible, they are rare and exceptionally difficult. Prosecutors must demonstrate not only that a crime occurred, but how it occurred, when it occurred, and who committed it, all without physical confirmation of death. In this case, investigators could not definitively establish a cause of death. They could not identify a time of death. They could not present a crime scene that conclusively showed violence. What they had was circumstantial evidence, strong in implication but limited in certainty. Circumstantial evidence can be powerful, but it must form a coherent, undeniable chain. Gaps weaken that chain, and here the gaps were substantial. There was also the challenge of alternative explanations. While unlikely, voluntary disappearance had not been legally ruled out. Abduction by an unknown party, though unsupported by evidence, could not be conclusively dismissed. Prosecutors must anticipate every argument a defense might raise. If doubt can be introduced, the case risks collapse. Investigators were careful not to overreach. Charging a suspect without sufficient evidence can do more harm than good. A failed prosecution can close doors permanently, preventing future charges even if stronger evidence later emerges. Law enforcement officials acknowledged the frustration this caused. To the public, the absence of an arrest felt like inaction. To investigators, it was restraint. Another complicating factor was the distinction between unrelated legal matters and the disappearance itself. Arrests or charges in other cases do not equate to guilt in this one. Investigators were clear on this point. They did not conflate separate issues. They treated the disappearance as its own case, requiring its own proof. Prosecutors also had to consider jury perception. A jury must be convinced beyond reasonable doubt. Emotional narratives do not substitute for forensic clarity. A case built primarily on inference risks acquittal, regardless of how compelling it appears outside the courtroom. For the family, this legal reality was painful. They believed strongly that she did not leave voluntarily. They believed something had happened inside that house. But belief, no matter how sincere, does not carry legal weight without corroboration. Law enforcement continued to emphasize that the case remained open, Evidence could still emerge. Witnesses could still speak. New forensic methods could still be applied. An arrest made too early could jeopardize all of that. This balance between urgency and caution is one of the most difficult aspects of criminal investigation. Move too slowly and evidence fades. Move too quickly and justice can be lost forever. In this case, investigators chose patience. They documented everything. They preserved evidence. They revisited statements. They waited for something solid enough to withstand cross-examination, appeal, and time. The lack of an arrest did not mean the absence of suspicion. It meant the absence of proof that met legal standards. And until that standard is met, the case remains in limbo, recognized as suspicious, treated as serious, but unresolved. This legal reality offers no comfort to those seeking answers. But it explains why silence persists where action is expected. Justice, when it comes, must be durable. Anything less risks disappearing just as completely as the woman at the center of this case. When a disappearance remains unsolved, the investigation does not end for the family. It becomes part of daily life, reshaping routines, relationships, and the passage of time itself. For those who loved her, the absence is not abstract. It is constant, present in ordinary moments where she should have been. Family members described living in a state suspended between hope and grief. Hope that answers might still come. Grief for the life that stopped without explanation. Unlike confirmed loss, unresolved disappearance offers no closure. There is no moment of finality, no clear boundary between before and after. The impact on her child was, and remains, one of the most painful realities of the case. A child grows and changes quickly, unaware of the full story, yet shaped by it in ways that cannot be undone. Milestones pass without her presence. Memories are formed without her voice. Questions will eventually come that have no simple answers. For the family, advocacy became a necessity. Speaking publicly was not a choice made lightly. Each interview reopened wounds. Each retelling required revisiting the uncertainty. But silence, they feared, would allow the case to fade from attention, and with it, the possibility of resolution. They emphasized her character repeatedly, her reliability, her devotion to her child, her plans for the future. These reminders were not meant to persuade, but to correct misconceptions. They wanted the public to understand that this was not a story of abandonment. It was a story of interruption. Living with unanswered questions imposes a unique burden. Every new day invites the same uncertainty. Did someone see something they did not realize was important? Did a moment pass unnoticed that could have changed everything? These questions linger, unresolved, year after year. The family's grief was compounded by the lack of definitive answers from law enforcement, not because investigators failed to care, but because evidence refused to surface. Understanding that distinction did not make the waiting easier. What remained was resilience. The family continued to speak her name, continued to mark anniversaries, continued to believe that silence does not mean forgetting, and that cases are solved not only by evidence, but by persistence. Their hope did not rest on spectacle or accusation. It rested on time, truth, and the belief that what happened cannot remain hidden forever. As of today, the case remains open. No arrest has been made for her disappearance. No definitive explanation has been offered. Investigators have confirmed that there is no evidence she left Georgia after entering that home, and they have not ruled out foul play. Beyond that, the record remains silent. Unsolved cases occupy a difficult space in the justice system. They are neither concluded nor forgotten. They exist in files, in evidence rooms, and in the minds of those still searching for answers. Progress can come suddenly, years later, sparked by a single statement, a re-examined detail, or a piece of evidence once overlooked. Until that moment arrives, what remains is absence. Absence of certainty, absence of closure, absence of a voice that should still be heard. Her story is not one of mystery for mystery's sake. It is a reminder of how quickly ordinary life can fracture, and how silence can become the most troubling evidence of all. For families of the missing, awareness matters. Tips matter. Memory matters. Time does not erase truth, it only tests whether it will be pursued. If you have information related to this case, authorities continue to encourage contact with law enforcement. And if you or someone you know is affected by domestic stress, disappearance, or crisis, resources exist to provide support. Some stories end with answers. This one, for now, ends with a question. What happened after she walked into that house? Until that question is answered, the case remains open, and the silence remains unresolved.